there are my contact details, and there's my title. Sorry, I don't believe in reading out PowerPoint slides, and I think I'm going to run out of time. So I'll press straight ahead. One of the things I find most interesting about visual music, it's perhaps one of the things that's frustrating about it as well, is I don't think it's really a thing. It's not an art form in itself, it's not a genre, it's not a school, it's an idea, I think, that lots of different people have come to from different directions over the years and continue to do so. So Dadaists, DJs, live audiovisual artists, musicians, filmmakers, animators, all sorts of people. And I think all of these different constituents bring something new to the table, a new set of ideas, a new set of paradigms, a new set of ideas for creating work. This is my background. These three kind of, if we drew a Venn diagram, these three areas kind of overlap. How many other people in this room also come from this sort of end of things? Yeah, quite a few. I was assuming less, I have to say. So some of the things that I'll be talking about might be preaching to the floor a little bit. Yeah, this is where I come from. I worked with Beast, Birmingham Electroacoustic Sound Theatre in the UK for a long time. And that was my kind of apprenticeship, really. That's what I learned. And even though I've worked with multimedia for getting on for 15 years now, I think that my thinking is very much influenced by these fields. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, from a perspective as a practitioner, I'm going to talk about what I've learned through my work in a very kind of subjective way. I don't really apologise for that. Is ideas that I learned working firstly in pure sound, pure electroacoustic, acousmatic, musique concrète work, that I've attempted to kind of move over into the visual domain. And I'm not, of course, alone in this. There are plenty of other people from this background working in these areas. Diego Garro was mentioned earlier. He's written a number of papers, particularly taking acousmatic ideas and applying them to the visual domain. So it's a broader area of practice than just myself. But I'm going to talk about a couple of ideas from my own practice. So just to start with some very simplistic definitions, and this is where I'm a bit worried about how many people in the room are from my field, because I'm going to have to be very simplistic here. I'm going to just stick with musique concrète for now and forget about electroacoustic and acousmatic. Those terms seem to require more explanation, and this, of course, the original term coined by Schaeffer, does the job of what I'm interested in today. And musique concrète being, in an incredibly simplistic way, music made from real sounds, sounds from the real world. And like a lot of ideas, this has to be put in historical context. In the late 40s, when he coined this term, music was a very specific cultural activity. It took place in concert halls using an incredibly limited range of sound material. Sounds produced by bits of string attached to bits of wood and pipes that you blew down, otherwise known as instruments. And the revolutionary idea of musique concrète was to expand that palette to include all the sounds that we hear all around us all the time. And that's what I'm interested in my audiovisual work, is to use imagery from around me, from my life. And this is the reason why I work. I'm not probably saying this is any better than any other way of working, but I work with video, not with animation. I work with footage that I've found somewhere, because that's the way I worked with sound. I worked with recorded sound rather than synthesized sound, and I've carried on that practice. Now, I want to just quickly look at a couple of ideas from musique concrète. Firstly, just to postulate the idea of a visual musique concrète. So this, we take visual music as the expression of musical ideas through visual means. Again, a very simplistic definition. We could possibly take musique concrète ideas and express them visually. So, to take a few ideas from musique concrète and to broaden their usage, perhaps. So firstly, very core concept, already been mentioned today, objet sonore, or sound object, and fairly obviously you might think about a video object, or a visual object, or a light object. You talked about an audiovisual objet, audiovisual, that's another possibility. But I've very much taken this approach with my video work, of firstly taking pieces of video from the real world that I use in my work, but also using some of the same methodologies. So again, being simplistic, one of the qualities about a sound object is generally a little thing. It's a small sound. It's not half an hour of street sounds. It's usually just a single identifiable, discrete sound. And I tend to work like that visually, working with very, very short, tiny clips of video. To the extent that I'm generally working with single frames now, which I'll come to at the end. And that kind of microscopic level of working video, I think, is something that I've taken from electroacoustic music concrete. Going alongside the idea of a sound object or a video object is a very key idea, and this is what I'm going to focus on for most of my talk today. This is the idea of reduced listening, and it's actually one of the core concepts around the sound object and what makes it interesting and what makes it different to the idea of just a sample, which is a much more common idea, much more kind of popular idea at the moment. If we took, say, a bell and we hit the bell and we recorded the bell, the sound object is not the bell. The sound object is the recording of the bell. You then kind of throw the bell away, and the kind of slightly rarefied and conceptual idea behind this, expressed by composers such as Dennis Smalley in particular, is that one should be able to cultivate a kind of listening where one actually doesn't even think about the source of the sound, where the entire art is the sounds themselves in isolation, divorced from the source. I think it's a very interesting idea. I also think it's an impossible idea, very contentious, personal view. I'm just going to play a little illustration here. This is a piece of Dennis Smalley, Pont, from 1974, P-E-N-T-E-S. I know that piece is made from harpsichord sounds, lots of sounds recorded inside the harpsichord at the GRM in Paris, and to some extent Dennis has been extremely successful in terms of reduced listening. That doesn't put me in mind of a harpsichord in any way, shape or form. One wouldn't know that that was the sound source unless one knew. However, and this is where I think the idea of reduced listening breaks down as too strong a term, but it doesn't exactly achieve what someone like Smalley is looking for, is that one cannot listen to sounds like that without imagining a source, I would argue. For me, it's insects in a primordial swamp. It doesn't matter what it is. Generally, it's something quite anthropomorphic. I think we tend to kind of project behaviours, physicalities onto sounds, and I don't think we actually can listen to sounds as purely abstract entities. I think we associate sound with sources, therefore we imagine sources if we don't know what they are. I'm kind of labouring that point a little bit, and the reason for that is that what I want to propose today is a visual corollary to reduced listening. I can't work out what to call it. Reduced looking doesn't really do it for me. I've tried unlooking. Visual disassociation is what I'm calling it for now. And my idea here, and something that I've strived at in my work, is to achieve the same thing of a visual, video-based. This is obviously important. With animation it would be easy, but a video-based material that's removed conceptually from its source. And the reason I wanted to labour this point about reduced listening not quite working is that I think this is even harder to achieve. We seem to have a very hardwired propensity to read images, to read things into images, however abstract and complex they are. So an example, I don't think there are any clouds today, but if you look up at the sky at little fluffy clouds, you always see animals or faces, or it's usually animals or faces. Depends when you've been smoking. But you know, mildew blotches on the wall, we see shapes, don't we? We all read them in some way, and it's very hard to divorce oneself from that. And what I now realise, working at for the last 15 years really, is towards a way of making images work in this way, of making images less prone to reading in some ways, and more than in the sonic domain. I think me as an artist, whoever's creating the images, has to help that to happen. It's not going to happen unless you actually make imagery in which in which the viewer, the listener, is helped to achieve this state. And I've arrived at really two sides of the coin of ways of doing this, which initially were very instinctive on my part, and I've kind of codified over time. Now, the first piece that I made on my own, the first sound image piece, did a number of collaborations before that, was a piece called Zoetrope in 1998. And this was the piece where I really discovered both of these things. And I discovered them by accident, I think, from a slightly different motivation, but it actually speaks quite well as to why this is interesting, why this is important. Who cares about disassociated viewing or reduced listening? I think the reason is that I think the sort of elephant in the room with visual music, with any kind of audio-visual work, is that we only have so many neurons, we only have so much concentration to focus on an artwork. Therefore, if you bring in audio, well, from my perspective, if I'm starting with audio and I bring in images, suddenly I'm expecting my listener to countenance all this other stuff as well. And I think to make a successful marriage of sound and image, you need to reduce in some way. Something has to go. And I found this very specifically in this piece. As I say, it was my first audio-visual piece. What I've found in my collaborative pieces, and I've done a number of quite commercial sort of film and TV soundtracks, that sort of thing. It's a very standard gripe really, but that sound is the poor cousin in those scenarios. Generally, what people perceive primarily in watching TV and watching film is the visual. And the sound is extremely important actually, but it tends to interact in a much more kind of subconscious way. So you watch a film with great music, and you just think, what a great film. You don't generally, or most people don't really think great sound design, great film. I probably do, but most people will just take that added value and the director gets all the credit. And I wanted to find ways of really kind of keeping people listening. And I think it's a cultural thing. It's something to do with what happens when we look at the screen. As soon as we see TV or film, we enter into this kind of suspension of disbelief. We see the film as a frame, the screen as a frame, a window through which we look onto a narrative or a documentary. And when we enter into that state, I'm going to say just contentiously, I think we stop thinking, but I think we also stop listening. Certainly we stop listening consciously. And I wanted to stop that happening. So what I aimed at with Zoetrope, which happens to conform to my idea of visual disassociation, was a very kind of flat surface of a screen. You're never taken away from the screen. The images are non-dimensional, and I'm sure that will not make any sense given previous discussions, but you can't really tell whether they're two-dimensional or three-dimensional. There's lots of information removed, which means you can't tell what kind of space you're in. Secondly, there's a very particular reason why the primary material of the piece is videos now, because that is the stuff of screens. So rather than seeing the screen as a video or something, it's something that only happens on a screen. You don't see videos anywhere else. So I wanted to keep reminding people of this. Towards two extremes, and these are the two areas in which I believe you can make visual dissociation happen. One is through minimal means, so through black or silence. I think it's very easy to not imagine the source of something if there's nothing to imagine. A bit obvious really. Now, I've kind of pretended there's an equivalence between these two. There isn't a phenomenological equivalence between silence and black. It depends what medium you're working in. So obviously with video, with a light-based source, then one could easily argue silence is no sound, black is no light. But of course if you were working with pigment, then that would be the equivalent of silence, I guess, a blank white sheet. But I'm actually very suspicious of any equivalence across sound and image, and I don't really think that works. But regardless of that, using a lot of black in video work either by just great long spaces where there's nothing to see at all, which I've used in several of my pieces, so you have to listen, or by within the frame, there being a lot of black with just a tiny, tiny amount of visual information, I find somehow, subjectively, keeps one in that listening space, keeps someone listening. So here's an example from the beginning of Zoetrope, and there's an idea behind this which I didn't follow through really in the rest of the piece, which is of an inverse relationship between sound and image. So more image means less sound, more sound means less image, which is kind of counterintuitive against the sort of big visual bang means big sonic bang. The opposite might happen, the image might kind of suck away the sound. And my first idea for this piece was to do a multimedia piece where you never got the media at the same time. It was always either sound or image, never both together. And you can kind of see that in this opening section, which I didn't stick to in the rest of the piece, really. Have I got sound? Show you really to see this kind of minimalist approach, really. More recently, although you can see it in Zoetrope as well, I've arrived at the conclusion that the opposite works as well, and to work with noise rather than silence. I'm not the only person to speak about this, but there's a kind of subjective bell curve, I think, across complexity from silence to noise. We have silence to noise in this direction, and kind of sensory excitement in this direction, then from nothingness here, from silence to blackness. As things get more complex, the sensory excitement increases, but there's a certain critical point at which it starts to decrease again. And when you get to absolute silence, to absolute noise, to pure white noise, it's actually very equivalent perceptually to silence. It's an absence, it's a nothing. And I find that you can achieve this same visual dissociation or reduced listening through noise. Now notice that I've not even tried to make a kind of sound-image pairing here. Just use the term white noise. Interestingly, of course, that's a sound term. That's what we call noise. But it incorporates a visual word, white. And the reason I sort of mention this is that I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about what visual noise might be. It's not really obvious. If we take this term literally, then visual noise is white light. But I don't think perceptually that's what most of us see noise as being. I think most of us see noise as this. We think of as noise. It doesn't really matter if we don't say it. Sorry. And yeah, a lot of Zoetrope is made out of this material, the video snow. And of course, you know, it is the visual equivalent of radio static. It's the residual energy of the Big Bang, I believe, which is quite a nice idea. And actually, maybe I will have a little bit of sound for this. This is a good example of why using just pure noise in this section of the piece is interesting. What I did here was I used a kind of process of non-real-time feedback. So I played the video noise on the screen, recorded that on the camera, then played the tape on the screen, recorded that on the camera, played the tape on the screen, recorded it on the camera, just like I'm sitting in a room, you know that piece, with video. And so you're progressively zooming in and in and into the noise visually. I'll just skip ahead slightly. But what's interesting is, A, what happens when you really do that to a great extent. You get this completely chaotic and quite interesting material that kind of just emerges from nowhere. But secondly, to shut up for a minute there, because I put that section of the piece with a very regular pulse, I think one starts to see that material as rhythmic or structured in some way, even though it's completely unstructured. Okay, 5 minutes. I knew I was going to run out of time. I'm just going to put this in context a little bit and try and argue to you that I think once I've arrived at these things in my own work, I kind of see evidence of it elsewhere, and I've made much of my background in electroacoustic music concrete and how I've brought things to the table there. But actually, needless to say, I think some of these things have already been discovered and have already been used by other artists. And I find, in fact, that a lot of visual music from the canon tends towards towards black, towards silence, or tends towards noise. I just want to briefly, this is a very new idea, by the way, so you probably shoot me down in flames, but I think I'm on something. So, tending towards silence, a very good example is any one of the Oscar Fischinger studies. Actually, I've chosen study number 6 here for no particular reason. This works for many of them. I've made a little max patch here, just as a silly little demonstration. Max patch, and I can load in the Fischinger study. And yeah, what you see on the right here is just literally it's divided all the pixels into black and white. Because if you look carefully at the original Fischinger, of course, there's bits of grey in there. And then I simply count the number of black pixels and express that as a percentage of the total available number of pixels. Can you see that? Just there we go. So it's generally 99 and 98% black throughout. And if you take the average over the whole piece, it's 98.7 black. And all the Fischinger studies, as I say, I've only just started doing this kind of strange activity, conform to that. And I don't know, it's just an interesting thing, but I find a lot of early visual music of the kind of abstract cinema ilk falls into that category. So if you think of Diagonal Symphony, Viking Egerling, the Hans Richter pieces, Walter Ruttmann, Opus 1, they all are mostly black. And I find that really interesting. Looking at the other extreme, and again there are plenty of examples where this works. I've got another slightly more complex but still very simple max patch. And all this one does is look at the difference between successive frames. I missed out a bit of the talk, which is going to make this slightly non-sequitur-ish. But this was a little clip I wanted to show you earlier on about Jackson Pollock. It's just a standard TV documentary. And what we see on the right are any pixels that change frame by frame. And what we see at the bottom there is, again, a percentage of the pixels that change. And you can see it's generally extremely low, generally kind of 2, 3, 4%. Occasionally it gets thrown by a wobbly camera, in that case, or of course an edit will produce a very high spike. But again, if you take an average over a standard TV broadcast, it's always less than 10% change frame by frame over a piece of programming. If I, sorry, I need to close that. We'll finish in a minute.
Two minutes.
Yeah. Two matches called the same thing. If I load in a piece of Stan Brakhage, for instance, who I mentioned in the question earlier, then you'll see the percentages are much, much, much higher. Now, it's kind of obvious, really, if you think about how Brakhage works. He's manipulating directly film, so every frame is almost completely different to any other frame. So I'm surprised the percentages are not higher. They're generally kind of 50-odd. I guess because there are some areas of quite uniform colour in there. But suffice to say, it's much, much higher. And I've found this, again, in a lot of perhaps more recent visual music work, a lot of 60s light show work. Anyone who's working directly onto the frames, so a lot of Norman McLaren, Len Lai, have these very high percentages of change frame by frame. So I've completely run out of time, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about the work I'm doing at the moment. I said at the beginning, I've got this kind of sound object, video object down to the extent that I'm working on single frames, and at the moment I'm making a piece entirely out of frames shot with an SLR. Just abstract frames of anything. I've been walking around Montreal taking pictures of buildings. It doesn't actually matter what they are. And the reason I've got these max patches is that what I'm doing is I'm letting Max sort them out for me. So I set it with running overnight with a big folder of images and say, okay, I want you to find images that are 40% different to each other, 70% different to each other, and make sequences that way. And you can control the complexity of your images in a fantastic and magical way. I better leave it there. My computer's decided to.
It's really interesting. So, question at dinner time. So, Brian.
Just one question. Can you say a few words about the scene sound?
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, it is. It's a bit cheeky.
I
was going to actually, but I work at Concordia University, and I'm running an event slightly similar to this, a similar sort of size, 2 days, on visual music. It's the second of these events on the 29th, 30th of October. And it is worth mentioning because one of the key themes of this particular event is direct sound, is manipulating the soundtrack. So we've got some very interesting speakers on that, including Andrei Smirnov, who is an expert on the very early Russian tradition of this, which actually predates anything else. Very, very interesting. Anyway.
Is it when?
It's the 29th of October. It is there in very small print.
Yeah.
But yeah, the website seeingsound.co.uk. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.